1,600 corpses, most stripped to the bone, some still clutching rosaries, others frozen mid-scream, found in a sea cave on the Scottish coast, and no one, not a soul, had ever noticed they were missing. That's the moment history stopped whispering and began howling. What you're about to hear was never meant to survive. A story so dark the Crown tried to erase it, so gruesome the Church refused to exorcise it. You've heard of Jack the Ripper, of Vlad the Impaler, but none of them come close to Sawney Bean, not in scale, not in secrecy, not in the sheer machinery of evil. This isn't murder. If you are listening to this story, then tell us in the comments where you are from. So, before we start this story, please like and subscribe to my channel, and don't forget to press the bell icon. This is an entire bloodline of disappearance, a 25-year-long feeding ritual buried beneath stone and sea foam. This is the tale of a family that lived off human flesh, entirely. And I don't mean myth, I mean documented horror. We begin in the black heart of the 1500s, Scotland torn by civil unrest, a land where witches were burned and enemies of the state vanished overnight. Sawney Bean was born into that chaos, but this man, if you can even call him that, didn't rebel against the system. He left it. Vanished into the cliffs with a woman who may have been his sister, and together they birthed a lineage that never rejoined civilization. They didn't just hide, they adapted. They became something else, a tribe, an institution of horror, a new kind of predator hiding in the cracks of a fractured society. For over 2 decades, travelers vanished on the roads between Girvan and Ballantrae, entire families gone. But no cries were heard, no bones were found, no patterns noticed, until it was far too late. This is not just a story of cannibalism. This is the blueprint of generational madness. Psychological control, incest, total isolation, and ritualized devouring, all hidden behind the camouflage of nature and silence. What you're about to hear isn't fiction. It's what happens when a bloodline decides it no longer needs the world, when survival evolves into domination, when feeding becomes theology. And this isn't just about the past, it's about what still echoes under the surface. You're not just watching a story, you're joining the descent into hunger, into madness, into Sawney Bean. But Sawney Bean was not born a monster. He was made, and what forged him was not merely poverty or exile, but humiliation. Legend says he was the bastard son of a hedge worker, scorned by his village, denied even the dignity of apprenticeship. But the truth is far more brutal. His real name, long since scrubbed from church records, was Alexander Bean, and his mother wasn't a farm wife. She was accused of witchcraft in 1537, burned in public while clutching her pregnant belly. Witnesses said she laughed through the flames. That child, pulled screaming from her corpse, would become the patriarch of the most infamous cannibal clan in Western history. Raised in the margins of society, Alexander saw no justice, no compassion, only hierarchy, power, submission. He wandered for years, stealing to survive, learning that the law only protects those who obey it, and only when it suits the elites. But then he met Agnes Douglas, later known as Black Agnes, a woman expelled from her own village for murdering her child and rumored to possess unnatural appetites. What began as lust twisted quickly into doctrine. They didn't just flee into the caves of Benane Head. They crafted a new system, a reversal of civilization, no laws, no currency, only survival. And then the feeding began. At first it was scavenging, dead travelers, isolated beggars, but soon that wasn't enough. They began hunting, deliberate, ritualistic. Bodies were stripped, dismembered, boiled, smoked, and stored in deep, salt-lined tunnels. No name was ever written. No grave was ever marked. And so, for 25 years, Scotland bled, and no one could trace the wound. This wasn't insanity. It was structure, a system built on psychological control. Agnes bore 14 children. Those children bred with each other. Then their offspring followed suit, a closed loop of loyalty, of blood, of flesh. By the time they were discovered, the clan numbered nearly 50. Think about that. An entire society underground, raised never to speak to outsiders, taught only to hunt, butcher, consume, and obey. You still think this is just about cannibalism? No. This is about the mechanics of total domination. About the perfect prison where the prisoners don't know they're trapped, because they built the bars themselves. Inside the cave, time broke. There were no seasons, no years, only cycles of hunger, of hunting, of harvest. The Bean clan's existence was built around one commandment: never be seen. Children were raised in total darkness. They were taught to walk silently, barefoot on wet stone, to dismember bodies with precision before they could even write. Language itself was altered. Words like friend, mercy, or future were forbidden. In their place, flesh, silence, blood. Every act became sacred. Every limb stripped of muscle was a sermon. Every scream swallowed by the crashing tide was scripture. And at the center of this living religion stood Sawney and Agnes, high priests of an inverted gospel. The children didn't know love. They knew obedience. They didn't know play. They knew stalking. To be born into this family wasn't to live, it was to serve. Serve the cave, serve the appetite, serve the hierarchy of horror. Even the dead had utility. Bones were carved into tools, needles, spears, jewelry. Skulls were used as lantern stands. Skin was tanned and repurposed into belts or bedding. This was not madness. It was design. A blueprint of generational programming so complete, escape became unthinkable. The children were never told of the outside world, only that it was poison, that outsiders would blind them, burn them, starve them. Psychological control disguised as protection. And it worked, for decades. Because this is what happens when you isolate minds, when you build a system where all paths point inward and punishment is rebranded as love. They weren't just hiding in a cave, they were building a kingdom beneath our contempt. A parallel world ruled not by money, but by raw, ancestral instinct. Sawney didn't run from society. He replaced it with something far older, something primal, something that echoes in every cult, every closed community, every institution where obedience becomes identity. The cave was more than shelter. It was a womb, and what it birthed was not just a family, but a force. One the crown would eventually fear. One they would try to erase. But not before the damage was done, not before the tide brought a secret to shore that reeked of smoke, marrow, and betrayal. And then someone escaped, not from the cave, but from the trap the Beans set above it. A merchant and his wife, returning from a coastal fair, found their carriage ambushed near Ballantrae. The horses were slashed open, the wheels shattered. Out of the mist came figures, barefoot, growling, pale as death, and armed with crude but deadly tools. They dragged the merchant's guards into the trees, ripped them apart before they could scream. But this one couple had something different. They fought. They had pistols. The wife was wounded, but the man managed to shoot 2 of the attackers, one fatally, a child, no older than 14, with sharpened teeth and a necklace made of knuckles. The rest of the Beans fell back into the woods, vanishing like vapor. And for the first time in over 2 decades, someone had survived an encounter. What happened next shook Scotland to its foundations. The man, still bleeding, reached the nearest town and collapsed. But not before mumbling a single phrase: "White-eyed children eating the dead." That was all it took. Panic spread. Locals began to whisper about the disappearances again, stories they'd buried. Families recalled travelers who'd gone missing, merchants who never returned. Suddenly, the myth had a face, a location, and soon, a reckoning. But the crown didn't act out of mercy. This wasn't justice. It was containment. King James VI assembled a personal detail of 400 men, soldiers, hounds, and scouts, under orders to wipe out the source. Not investigate, not arrest, erase. This wasn't a trial. It was an execution with royal paperwork. And yet, even with dogs, torches, and muskets, it took 3 days to find the cave. Because the entrance was a breathing wound hidden behind a tide-slick cliff, visible only during specific low tides, and what they found inside made war-hardened men vomit. 1,600 corpses, some whole, most butch, aired, skulls cracked like eggs, ribs harvested, flesh-stained bedding, child-sized knives, and in the center a massive pit, a cooking hole, still warm, still smoking. This wasn't a family. This was a nation of predators, raised not by nature, but by choice. And when the torches revealed pale eyes staring back from the darkness, that's when the real nightmare began. They didn't scream, not one of them. When the soldiers flooded the cave, muskets raised, commands echoing off wet stone. The Bean clan simply stared, filthy, gaunt, coated in blood and bone dust, but utterly calm. Like animals that had never known fear, or like priests caught mid-prayer. Sawney himself was found seated on a throne of driftwood and femurs, flanked by Agnes, her eyes hollow and shining with defiance. Their children, dozens of them, stood in rows behind them, not blinking, not begging. The youngest was barely 5, the oldest nearly 30. All of them inbred, all of them indoctrinated. The soldiers had expected chaos, but this stillness, it was worse. The Beans didn't resist arrest. They didn't deny anything. And when questioned, Sawney only smiled and said, "We took what was abandoned. The rest came to us. They always do." That smile was the final crack in Scotland's collective sanity. These weren't rabid beasts. These were missionaries of consumption. The royal forces bound them, chained them in iron carts, and marched them through towns like circus freaks. Crowds jeered, women fainted, priests vomited. But Sawney only watched, calm, cold, unrepentant. They were taken not to trial, but to extermination. No jury, no defense. King James ordered immediate execution under royal prerogative. The men were dismembered alive, limbs removed one by one to deny them a clean death. The women and children were forced to watch, then burned, not out of justice, but fear that even one seed of this ideology might survive. And yet, even in the flames, they sang. That's what the records say, that Agnes, burning, sang lullabies to the charred remains of her daughters, that one of the older boys, bleeding from 4 stumps, recited family names like scripture. The goal was annihilation. But what if it wasn't enough? What if some of them weren't there that day? What if a Hild was hunting during the raid? What if the ideology lived on, in silence, in shadow? Because here's the truth empires won't admit. If a system works, someone will resurrect it. If control can be passed through blood, it can be passed again. You think the story ends here? No, brother, it begins here. This is when the curse spreads, one body at a time. But legends never truly die. They metastasize. After the executions, King James sealed the records. Clerks were forbidden to speak. Church officials denied involvement. And the cave, blasted with gunpowder and sealed with stone, but not before certain contents were removed by men not in uniform, quiet men, paid in gold. Witnesses claimed they saw horse-drawn carts hauling barrels out of Benane Head at dusk, covered in royal crests and guarded by men who did not speak Gaelic or English. What was in those barrels? Some say bones, others books, Hand-stitched records the Beans kept, rituals, names, diagrams of butchery passed down like psalms. But whatever it was, it vanished. And then, so did the official story. For 2 centuries there was silence. Nothing in the newspapers, nothing in the schools, just whispers, but whispers that don't die become doctrine. And in 1799, during excavation for a naval storehouse near Girvan, workers unearthed a tunnel lined with bones, human bones, arranged geometrically, with sigils drawn in dried blood still faintly visible. The government seized the site within hours. Official explanation? Smugglers' hideout. But the locals knew better. They remembered. They still feared the hills at dusk. Parents warned their children, stay off the coast or the white-eyed ones will take you. You see, horror that deep becomes cultural marrow. It's inherited. It breeds in dreams, in fears, in laws, and it doesn't fade. It adapts. In 1812, a Scottish orphanage in Edinburgh reported a rash of children gone missing. All red-haired, all from troubled homes, no signs of forced entry. But one thing was found, a child's finger left on a windowsill, cleanly severed, bone exposed, wrapped in a strip of human skin stitched into the shape of a spiral, a message, a calling card, or something older, something ritual. You think Sawney Bean's curse ended with fire, and steel? No. It slipped into the bloodstream of history, into families, into institutions, maybe into yours. And the more you dig, the more you find fingerprints in places they shouldn't be. Schools, asylums, orphanages, underground bunkers. The pattern repeats, hidden in plain sight. Because what the Beans started was never just about hunger. It was about control, and control is eternal. They said it was over, that the Bean line was broken, but bloodlines don't end. They dilute, they disguise. Records of the youngest Bean children were incomplete. The soldiers couldn't name them all. And amidst the chaos of the raid, a few tracks were found leading away from the cliffs, small footprints, barefoot, headed north. The official narrative dismissed them as animal trails. But in 1823, a series of disappearances began near Inverness. Always the same. Lone travelers, mostly women, vanishing near the forest edge. At first, authorities blamed wolves, then bandits. But then came the letter, scrawled in ash on cured sheepskin, delivered to the magistrate's office without return. It read, "Your kingdom fed on us. Now we feed on yours. The blood remembers." The signature? A single spiral inked in brown, a hunting symbol used only by one family. The Bean spiral. Investigators searched for cults, fanatics, any rational explanation. But the truth was older, simpler, more terrifying. The ideology had survived. The system of secrecy, domination, and flesh consumption had gone feral, not dead, just dispersed. One daughter to a traveling tanner, one son to a northern widow, another traded to a Romani caravan. And with each new generation, the teachings were passed in secret, modified, hidden under new names. They learned, they adapted. They no longer needed caves. They used basements, institutions, remote inns, and they stopped being sloppy. The modern-day descendants weren't monsters. They were gentlemen, surgeons, priests, historians. They wore masks of civility, but underneath, the hunger never left. Because it wasn't about taste, it was about power. To consume someone is to erase them, to digest their story, their existence, and replace it with your own will. The Bean bloodline didn't vanish, it evolved. They married into silence, into wealth, into anonymity, and that spy, Rail, it still appears, in the margins of psychiatric records, in chalk on asylum floors, etched into the bark of trees where hikers go missing. You've seen it. You just didn't know what it meant, until now. By 1891, the disappearances had become statistically undeniable. Along a cold strip of Scottish coastline, 32 people vanished over 14 months. No bodies, no ransom, no signs of struggle, just gone. Authorities blamed weather, shipwrecks, even madness. But local shepherds spoke of different things, of gutted deer found hanging in trees, of spiral patterns carved into stones overnight, of screams carried on the wind that sounded too human. And then came the journals, discovered by a railway engineer repairing an old tunnel near Culzean, buried in oilskin, sealed in wax, and written in a mix of archaic Scots and Latin. The handwriting varied, some elegant, some childlike, but the content, rituals, names, recipes, instructions on how to break a child's will in 14 days. A chapter titled The Doctrine of Hunger, and at the back, a family tree, Sawney and Agnes at the top. Below them, over 100 names, some crossed out, some annotated, taken by tide, too soft became bone. But 10 names, 10, were circled in red, and next to each, a date. The last one read, Isaac, 1891, escaped, must return. Return? Where? To the cave, to the blood, or to the doctrine? Because you must understand, for the Bean descendants, hunger is not just a craving, it's a covenant, a religion that survived flame, blade, and time. And these journals, once in state custody, were never released to the public, locked away in an Edinburgh archive for national security. But before they vanished, one scholar photographed every page, and when he tried to publish them, he disappeared. No struggle, no farewell, just vanished, like the victims on the coast. And weeks later a spiral was found drawn on his office door in something sticky, dark, and warm. You see now? This isn't folklore. It's infrastructure, an unbroken line of ritual predators hiding behind civility, and the ones who know, they stay silent. Because, see, the Beans don't just consume bodies, they consume records, legacies, truth. They are an erasure engine, and your memory is next. In 1924, deep beneath the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, a janitor named Alistair Muir uncovered a bricked-up corridor behind an unused surgical wing. It wasn't listed on any blueprint. No medical staff had access. But the smell, fetid, metallic, wrong, seeped through the cracks. When Muir finally pried open the bricks, what he found silenced him for the rest of his life. 3 rooms, crudely carved into the earth. Shackles embedded in stone. A butcher's table made of slate. And on the walls, etched spirals in sequences, like incantations. Dried tissue clung to metal hooks. But worse were the journals. Again, handwritten in varying styles, bound in stitched human skin. They spoke of preparatory diets, age thresholds, and psychic thresholds of edible fear. These weren't mad ramblings. They were manuals, institutional, methodical, passed down through orderly hands. Muir tried to alert the authorities. He was fired within a week. The entrance was resealed, and his family, who tried to go public, vanished in a house fire 6 months later. No one was charged. And the hospital records from that year? Gone, purged, scrubbed like it never happened. But the whispers kept surfacing, in asylums, orphanages, elite boarding schools, always near places of control, because that's what the Bean doctrine evolved into, not just flesh consumption, but identity control, the breaking of lineage, the redirection of will. They didn't just want to eat. They wanted to rewrite, convert, indoctrinate. They created programs disguised as therapy, exercises that mirror ritual preparation, sleep deprivation, forced silence, sensory fasting. The modern cannibal doesn't wear furs or wield knives. He wears a white coat, a priest's collar, a judge's robe, and he doesn't ask for your body. He takes your name, your history, your choices, and turns them into property. The family tree wasn't a relic, it was a blueprint. And if the line was ever broken, ever truly broken, they had measures in place. You think this ends in Scotland? No, that was just the origin. The curse spread like fire beneath the surface. Europe, America, Asia, anywhere where institutions could be created faster than they could be questioned. And at the center of each one spiral, always one. By the time World War II erupted, the Bean doctrine had already infiltrated the West's most protected sanctuaries, not through invasion, but invitation. Certain units within the British intelligence apparatus, particularly those involved in psychological warfare and classified human experimentation, began to adopt eerily familiar methodologies. Spiral-marked files were found in the ruins of a London psychiatric institute bombed during the Blitz. The papers inside detailed experiments on fear thresholds, how long a child could be deprived of language before forgetting their name, how isolation reshaped the nervous system, how hunger could be weaponized to induce religious obedience. At first, these documents were dismissed as German fabrications. But dates didn't match. The experiments predated Hitler. And the names on the files, W.G. Bean, A. Mackenzie Bean, F. Shawcross, showed up nowhere in public records. No births, no deaths, no marriages, just shadows, ghosts. And then, in 1949, a U.S. military attaché stationed in Edinburgh vanished. His last communication was a frantic telegram. They are not extinct. The bloodline is institutional. They wear rank. 2 weeks later, his body was found in a peat bog, intact, perfectly preserved, with a spiral carved into his chest. It wasn't random. It was a warning. Because by then, the Beans no longer needed secrecy. They had become the very system designed to catch them. They were doctors in charge of diagnosis, officers in charge of execution, archivists of their own erased crimes. The real war wasn't for territory. It was for identity, for lineage. To erase the individual and replace him with doctrine. Tell me, have you ever had a memory you couldn't place? A fear that didn't belong to you? An ancestral guilt? The spiral doesn't just mark flesh, it marks blood, it marks mind, and those who carry it often don't know until it's too late. Because the real legacy of the Bean clan wasn't cannibalism, it was control. Generational, ritualized, hidden under laws, robes, and flags. And you've already seen it, in the rules no one questions, in the institutions that punish without face. The spiral has been watching, and now it recognizes you. They call it lineal amnesia, when a bloodline forgets itself by design. It doesn't happen by accident. It's engineered. In 1957, during an excavation beneath a decommissioned boarding school in Aberdeenshire, workers unearthed an ossuary sealed behind a false wall. Hundreds of bones, children's bones, stacked neatly in rows, labeled by initials, and beside each one, a spiral etched into the limestone in charcoal and iron dust. There was no public investigation, no police involvement. The school had been funded by a trust tied to an old estate, the Shawcross family, direct descendants of a Bean daughter who'd vanished into the clergy in 1732. The land was quietly purchased by the crown within days, bulldozed, repurposed as farmland. But one set of photos escaped, snapped by a former student-turned-photographer who'd been hired to document the renovation. His name was Thomas Garrick. He mailed the negatives to himself in London. He never arrived. His apartment was ransacked, his studio set ablaze. No body was ever recovered, just ash and a spiral burned into the wood beneath the floorboards. You think these are coincidences? You think institutions built by blood forget how to hide blood? No, they've refined it, streamlined it. They use euphemisms now: special education facilities, rehabilitative isolation, heritage boarding. But behind every polished title is the same principle: remove the child from his story, sever his name, indoctrinate him under hunger, not for flesh anymore, but for identity, obedience, void. Because that's the new hunger, compliance. The world's greatest predators don't wear masks or claws. They wear patience, paper, respectability, and they feed not on what you are, but on what you were meant to be. The bean curse didn't die. It just learned how to pay taxes, and for those unlucky enough to carry the spiral in their blood, the signals still call. Nightmares, strange marks, unexplained obsessions. They'll say it's schizophrenia, trauma, delusion. But what if it's memory? What if it's your bloodline pulling you back into a legacy you were bred to forget? Are you really free, or just domesticated? In 1966, the UK Home Office commissioned a secret report titled Intergenerational Contagion Patterns in Remote Ancestral Lineages. The language was clinical, sanitized, but buried in the middle was a case study labeled only as Family B73. No location, no photos, just transcripts of interviews with second-generation children raised in isolation in a rural coastal compound. All bore the same traits: emotional flatness, food ritualization, violent reactions to mirrors, and one more thing. They all drew spirals, not circles, spirals, in chalk, blood, soot, always counterclockwise, always beginning from the outside, pulling inward. The researchers noted something odd. These children scored higher on certain cognitive tests, but displayed zero empathy. They obeyed any instruction instantly, even when asked to harm themselves or others. When the youngest, a boy named L, was asked why he followed these commands, he whispered, "Because if I don't, the silence eats me." The silence. That's how they described it. Not a person, not a place, a force, a hunger they couldn't name but always felt. One researcher described the effect as presence within absence, as if something ancient was still inhabiting the family structure itself, even if none of the original beings remained. The facility where these studies were conducted? It burned to the ground in 1968, no survivors. The report was sealed for 50 years, but one copy, redacted, fragmented, was leaked by an anonymous whistleblower in 2019. Linguists and historians who analyzed the leaked pages confirmed an alarming trend. The patterns described mirrored rituals found in pre-Celtic death cults tied to cannibal fertility rites. But more disturbingly, the handwriting in the original notes matched known signatures of figures thought to be dead for over 100 years. That's the kind of detail you're not supposed to notice. Because if writing survives, it means doctrine survives, and if doctrine survives, the spiral still spins. The bean curse isn't a myth, it's an operating system, a generational software that rewires each host through hunger, fear, and obedience. And if you feel something moving under your skin right now, if your dreams have been strange since we started, that's not coincidence. That's resonance. In 1973, a forgotten lighthouse off the coast of Galloway began emitting a signal again, after decades of silence. But this was no maritime beacon. The pulses weren't rhythmic, they were patterned. 3 long, 2 short, 1 long, repeating, not Morse, not military, something older. A cryptographer stationed at Bletchley Park, a man named Dr. Ellis Crane, recognized the pattern, not as a code but as a liturgical sequence found in pre-Christian Scottish funeral rites, rites attributed to the old tongue, a vanished language spoken by covens along the Firth of Forth. He followed the trail, tracing the pulses to their source, the Clackmara lighthouse, decommissioned in 1921 after a series of disappearances. Crane chartered a boat. He never returned. 3 months later, his journal washed ashore in a sealed glass bottle. Inside, a map of the lighthouse interior, marked with spirals and phrases like, "She waits below," and "They never stopped eating." His final entry simply read, "The stairs go deeper than the sea." When divers were dispatched to investigate, they found the lighthouse gutted, burned from the inside out. No bodies, but carved into the lantern room floor in scorched stone, the Bean family crest. Not a coat of arms, a glyph. Spiral intersected by bone. This wasn't a location, it was a pulpit. The spiral doctrine was broadcasting, calling to blood, reawakening old codes. And when archivists cross-referenced the pulse pattern with historical records, they found a match, not in Scotland but in Tennessee. A buried chamber beneath a church burned in 1906. Same symbols, same pulse. The spiral had crossed oceans, hidden in migration, baptized in new tongues, but unchanged. Because this isn't a local haunting, it's a continental inheritance. And every time someone tries to shut the signal down, they vanish. Or worse, they become transmitters themselves. Have you ever felt drawn to a place you've never been? A lighthouse, a church, a room in a dream. That's not memory. That's frequency. The doctrine calling home the blood it once shaped. And if you're hearing this now, you're not immune. You're the receiver. In 1981, a retired American surgeon named Dr. Malcolm Reeve published a limited-run memoir titled Confessions from the Quiet Table. It was printed privately, fewer than 200 copies, and buried in obscure medical libraries. On the surface, it read like a collection of surgical case studies. But between the lines, beneath the bland clinical tone, lay something far darker. Reeve described his time as a visiting scholar at the Royal Infirmary in Edinburgh during the late 1940s. He spoke of special procedures conducted after midnight on subjects brought in through back corridors, never logged in hospital records, children mostly, or prisoners marked unfit for rehabilitation. The operations weren't corrective. They were exploratory, psychospinal trepanning, adrenal punctures, taste gland rewiring, all conducted under the oversight of a shadow entity Reeve only identified as the eldest. He never saw his face, only the spiral ring he wore, which glinted during every procedure. Reeve's quiet table wasn't a metaphor. It was the name of the slab used in these sessions, made of stone, always cold, older than the hospital itself. It had been brought over from the Isle of Mull, where local myth claimed it was the site of clan sacrifices during harvest moons. Reeve's memoir ended with a single page, blank but for a phrase carved into the paper, not written but gouged deep by blade. The table feeds the doctrine, and the doctrine remembers who fed it. Within a year of publication, all known copies vanished. University archives claimed water damage, fire, theft. Reeve himself died of self-inflicted exsanguination in a locked room with no sharp objects found. The coroner's notes were sealed. His house burned a week later, but one microfiche copy survived. Found in the basement of a burned-out university wing in 2002 by a janitor who later disappeared. A scan was uploaded briefly to an underground forum. I saw it, and I memorized the phrase, "The doctrine remembers," because that's what this is. Not just a story, not even a secret. It's a memory the world keeps trying to forget, but blood never forgets. It pulses, hungers, calls, and the quiet table, it waits for the next man who thinks he's not part of this. In 1994, a flood tore through a rural Scottish township near Argyll, exposing long-buried stone vaults beneath the foundations of a collapsed orphanage. Among the rubble, rescue teams found a sealed iron door etched with a spiral and the Roman numeral 13. Behind it, a chamber that should not have existed. No records, no architectural plans, just a perfect circle of carved granite, lit only by a series of phosphorescent stones embedded in the walls, stones that glowed without heat, without wiring, without explanation. Inside were 13 wooden chairs, each facing inward, and in the center, a single child's chair, smaller, darker, splattered with something long dried. Carved into its backrest was a name, E. Bean. When authorities arrived, The chamber was gone. Sealed over. The door buried again in concrete. Witnesses silenced. But one rescue worker, a man named Callum Ferris, spoke out. He said when he entered the chamber, time bent. His watch spun counterclockwise. He heard voices, chanting, not in English, not even Gaelic. Something older. Something inside him. Ferris vanished days later. His apartment ransacked. His dog found dead, jaw broken backwards. On his wall, a spiral painted in his own blood. What they uncovered wasn't just a room, it was a ritual site. A memory looped into architecture. 13 chairs for 13 generations, one child seat in the middle. The doctrine doesn't just pass through blood, it's reenacted. Every few decades they rebuild, reopen, replay. Because the spiral isn't a symbol, it's an instruction, an operating cycle. And if you're starting to feel like you've seen this before, in dreams, in déjà vu, in flickers behind your eyelids when you close them at night, you're not hallucinating, you're remembering. Because once you see the ritual, it imprints. The spiral keeps turning, even in you, especially in you. That's why you're still here, still listening, still drawn. They say knowledge is power, but the old blood knows better. Knowledge is hunger. And this is the feast. In 2007, a forensic linguist named Dr. Lena Rausch published a paper that was buried within an obscure academic anthology titled Semiotic Echoes of Orphaned Cultures. Her study focused on speech patterns in isolated Scottish families that had refused census participation for over a century. What she uncovered was more than dialect. It was a recursive language, words that folded into themselves, sentences that changed meaning depending on breath placement, a syntax that obeyed spiral logic, out to in, then in to out. Rausch found that in these families, children were taught to speak in layers, surface language for outsiders, and a deeper, inward-facing code used only within bloodlines. In one recorded interview with a 9-year-old girl, the child answered every question with unsettling calm. When asked why she always spoke in rhyme, she replied, "Because if I stop, he hears me." Who? The hungry one that lives in the listening. That phrase appeared again in another recording, this time from a different village, different child, different decade. Always the same cadence. Always the same message. Rausch concluded that these families weren't just preserving culture, they were preserving programming. Vocal patterns as encryption keys. Sound as ritual lock. She traced the phenomenon back to oral traditions linked with the descendants of Alexander Bean, the supposed survivors who splintered off after the caves were collapsed. But here's the catch. Rausch died in 2008. Officially, carbon monoxide leak. Unofficially, her apartment was lined with noise-canceling foam, her phone was wrapped in tinfoil, and she had scrawled hundreds of spiral diagrams in her notebooks, each with the phrase, "Language remembers." Because it does. Sound carries shape. Rhythm carries memory. And the doctrine doesn't just survive in blood. It survives in lullabies, in prayers, in repeated family phrases. You don't even realize you're saying. The curse isn't just what they did, it's how they spoke. And if the spiral got in through sound, what do you think it's doing now, as I speak it into your ears? In 2011, an American oil company drilling exploratory wells near Loch Erebol unearthed something that halted the entire operation. Beneath 300 meters of shale and peat, their seismic imaging picked up a geometric anomaly. Man-made. A subterranean vault, not in any registry, sealed in lead-lined basalt. They sent down a probe. What came back wasn't oil. It was footage. A chamber, perfectly symmetrical, with walls covered in carvings, neither Celtic nor Norse. These symbols were older, rougher, but intentional. At the chamber's center stood a pedestal. On it, a blackened human skull, elongated, filed teeth, spiral etched into the forehead. A forensic anthropologist later claimed the cranium predated the Roman invasion of Britain. Yet embedded in the jawbone, a copper dental plate, manufactured in 1883. They ran DNA, partial match to the Bean bloodline. But here's where it fractures reality. The symbols on the walls weren't decorative. When arranged properly, they formed a map, not of a place, but of behavior. Spiral-shaped patterns of migration, marriage, isolation, and ritual sacrifice. Every 63 years, the cycle repeats. Same regions, same family clusters, same disappearances. And when the company's legal team attempted to suppress the footage, 5 members of the drill crew vanished. Their personal effects were found in a circle on the drilling platform. In the middle, a spiral burned into the steel, no fuel source detected. The site was quietly nationalized under a UK Heritage Act, renamed a geological hazard, and locked down by armed guards. But the footage leaked. I've seen it. And what chilled me most wasn't the skull or the carvings or the impossible dates. It was the sense that the vault hadn't been broken into. It had been waiting. That skull wasn't buried. It was entombed, honored, like a relic or a seed. The spiral doctrine doesn't just bury its dead. It plants them, and it waits for the blood to return and bloom. The next cycle isn't approaching. It's begun, and if the pattern holds, you'll feel it soon. In your gut, in your sleep, in your name. In 1966, a psychiatric hospital outside Inverness documented a rare condition they called cyclical fugue syndrome. Patients, all unrelated, would lapse into fugue states during the same lunar cycle each year. Their behaviors were uncannily synchronized, pacing in perfect spirals, chanting in Old Scots dialect, carving bones, sometimes their own, into shapes resembling family crests that no longer existed. The hospital staff assumed mass hysteria, until they noticed something chilling. Every one of these patients shared a surname that appeared, somewhere, distantly, in the genealogical spiderweb of the Bean family. Even those born in America, Canada, Australia. The bloodline wasn't just surviving, it was activating. Dr. Alistair Moran, the lead physician, began compiling a private registry he titled The Spiral Kin. He charted over 200 cases across 19 countries, all displaying the same symptoms, same date of onset, same spiral fixation, and always the same phrase spoken just before each episode began: "The taste is still in me." What were they remembering? What ancestral echo was bubbling up through the marrow? Moran's notes suggest the fugue wasn't a breakdown. It was a summoning, a key that opened something buried, not just in the mind, but in the bones. When Moran attempted to publish his findings in 1969, he was institutionalized by his own board. Diagnosis: paranoid schizophrenia. But here's what they buried, literally. In 2004, Moran's grandson unearthed a sealed box from beneath the floorboards of the old family estate. Inside were 42 hand-drawn spiral maps, each tied to a different descendant. At the center of each spiral, the name Bean. Some were crossed out, others circled in red, all still alive, or at least listed as such. The grandson, reported missing 6 weeks later, last seen standing barefoot in a loch, whispering in a language no one recognized. That's what this doctrine is. It's not legend, it's inheritance. A behavioral parasite writing down bloodlines, waiting for environmental triggers, moons, dates, symbols, names, to switch on what's been sleeping. The curse isn't fiction, it's epigenetic, and if your name echoes anywhere near that spiral, you were never going to escape. You were bred to remember, In 1932, a team of French anthropologists stationed in the Outer Hebrides reported a discovery so disturbing it was quietly stricken from all colonial records within a year. Tasked with cataloging dying dialects, they stumbled upon a coastal enclave that had no official name, no roads, no graves. Just 13 families living in stone hovels, their doors facing inward toward a central pit. The villagers spoke in rhyme, never directly, every conversation a circle. They refused outside food. Their children were pale, quiet, and marked behind the ears with identical burn scars in the shape of a spiral. At night, the team recorded low, droning sounds that vibrated through the peat. They traced it to the pit, a stone-lined shaft descending so deep their rope ran out. When they lowered a microphone, they picked up a sound not unlike chanting, but not human. It was slower, heavier, wet. The lead anthropologist Dr. Alphonse Giraud noted that villagers referred to the pit as le nourrisseur, the feeder. On the 7th night, 2 children from the research camp vanished. No struggle, no tracks, no scent for the dogs. The villagers said only, "He needs to remember." The next morning, Dr. Giraud burned all his field notes and begged for extraction. Weeks later, he submitted a final report claiming inclement weather made study impossible. Then he retired, moved inland, never published again. But his assistant, Claire Devane, kept one artifact, a small stone idol recovered from beside the pit. It depicted a malformed humanoid with elongated teeth and spiral glyphs for eyes. In 1971, Devane sent it anonymously to a folklore museum in Edinburgh. A week later, the curator suffered a nervous breakdown and carved a message into the exhibit wall. "It sleeps, but not deeply." The idol was lost, or hidden. Some say it was recovered during a private auction in Munich in 1999. Others say it wound as buried under a church that no longer exists. What matters is this: wherever these colonies appear, so does the spiral, so does the hunger, so does the ritual. Not to worship, but to feed, because the doctrine doesn't ask for belief, it only asks for bodies, and sooner or later, someone always brings them. In 1879, an anonymous document surfaced in Edinburgh, handwritten in archaic Latin and bound in human skin. Its title, scorched into the cover, was Devoratis Sanguine, of the blood that devours. The language was dense, looping, saturated with references to the family beneath the soil and rites of consumption older than the cross. Scholars dismissed it as deranged heresy, until someone noticed the margins. Every page contained faint watermarks, detailed anatomical diagrams not of a human body, but of a society. Veins became roads. Organs were institutions. The spine, marked with a spiral, was labeled Domus Bean, House of Bean. It wasn't a treatise. It was a manual, a blueprint for structuring control through ritual digestion, literal and symbolic. Feed the weak into the system. Restructure the survivors. Repeat. At the end of the manuscript, one sentence was written backwards, etched into the parchment so deeply it cut through to the next page. That which feeds on man will wear his face. The book disappeared 3 weeks later. The historian who reviewed it, Father Malcolm Wyeth, was found hanging in his rectory, face flayed clean off. Blood used to draw a spiral across his chest. The church, desperate to silence scandal, denied it all. But fragments of the manuscript reappeared over the decades, quoted in underground esoteric circles, recited in wartime interrogation manuals, cited quietly in the internal records of a secret British operation called Section H. This isn't myth, it's method. The doctrine has always used hunger as a tool, not just for flesh, but for obedience. It teaches you to crave authority, to worship hierarchy, to believe that being devoured means being chosen. Every institution that mimics this pattern church, state, school, family, was built on that spine, that spiral. And if you've ever felt like the world was feeding on you, it's because it is. The spiral eats inward, and when it reaches your name, your mind, your blood, it won't ask permission. It never has. It only opens wide and waits. In 1983, a remote prison hospital in Aberdeenshire began transferring certain inmates without official paperwork, medical clearance, or legal process. The men, most of them diagnosed with violent psychosis, were quietly moved to a facility known only by its internal code, Ward 73S. Officially, it didn't exist, but a whistleblower, an orderly named Paul Inver, kept notes. In them, he described a wing beneath the ground floor, carved not from brick, but from natural stone, as if the facility had been constructed around a pre-existing cavern. The patients weren't treated, they were studied, strapped into iron chairs, heads shaved, forced to listen to audio recordings on loop, chanting in spiraled cadence, phrases repeated in reverse Latin, and most chillingly, their own screams played back after being altered to match someone else's pitch. Inver said after 33 days of exposure, subjects stopped responding to human speech. They didn't speak. They didn't eat. They just stared. But when played certain spiral tones, they stood, recited names of ancestors they'd never been told about, and carved familial sigils into their skin. One subject, when asked what was happening, whispered, "He's waking the old teeth." Inver's final report claimed that this wasn't therapy. It was reactivation. The patients weren't mad. They were dormant. Fragments of the Bean bloodline with broken memories. And the state wasn't protecting the public from them. It was training them to return. Ward 73S was shut down after a fire in 1986. The official cause? Electrical fault. Unofficially? All doors were found open. All patients gone. The wing was sealed in concrete. But you can still hear the tapes. Copies circulate in the deepest corners of the web. They're called the spiral voice files, and if you listen long enough, they start saying your name. That's how the doctrine reclaims its own, not with violence, but resonance. If your blood remembers, the spiral will find you, through sound, through sleep, through whatever hole they left in your soul. In 1957, a classified joint project between the British Psychological Warfare Division and a private research firm known only as Argona initiated Operation Kinchunt, a covert experiment aimed at weaponizing inherited memory. The premise was simple and monstrous. If certain traumas, beliefs, and compulsions could be passed down through generations, then perhaps they could be triggered on command. The test subjects? Children of convicted murderers, selected for their ancestral volatility. What they didn't know, what no one outside Argona was supposed to know, was that every child in the program could trace distant lineage back to the Bean family. They were raised in artificial families, homes rigged with cameras, microphones, subliminal light patterns. At the age of 9, each child was exposed to a stimulus ritual, a recreated spiral-shaped chamber flooded with scent triggers, blood, seawater, ash, and a soundscape of low-frequency tones mimicking ancient Hebridean chants. Then the psychologists waited. By 14, nearly half the subjects exhibited identical psychogenic responses: disassociation, hunger blackouts, obsession with isolation, and, in 7 cases, unprovoked acts of violence accompanied by muttering in a dead language. One girl, patient 44B, drew a detailed map of the original Bean caves, despite being raised in rural Kent with no access to history books. When asked how she knew, she answered, "Because I was her." Her. Not one of them. Not a descendant. Her. Authorities burned the chambers, disbanded Argona, sealed the records under Official Secrets Act protocols, but fragments survived: a photograph, a journal entry, an audio file titled Inheritance. I've heard it. It's not a voice. It's a vibration, like your bones are being tuned to remember. That's what Operation Kinchant really was. Not control, but awakening. A generational sleeper signal embedded in the blow. Doubt. They weren't building weapons. They were reactivating a doctrine older than law. One where memory isn't stored in the mind but in the marrow, and once it's called, it answers. In 1998, an unmarked crate arrived at the archives of the Royal Scottish Geographical Society. Inside, a water-damaged journal, a partial human mandible, and a wax cylinder recording labeled South Pit, March 1891. No sender, no return address. The journal belonged to a cartographer named Ellis Rowan, who had vanished over a century earlier while mapping coastal cave systems along the Ayrshire cliffs, land suspected to be part of the original Sawney Bean territory. His entries started as routine, measurements, elevation notes, sketches of limestone patterns, but by page 34, the tone shifted. "The cave breathes," he wrote, "not wind, not tide, breath." Rowan described hearing voices deep in the rock, whispers not heard with the ear, but in the teeth. He reported dreams of a black table beneath the earth where generations feasted in silence, and waking with dirt under his fingernails and blood on his boots, despite no wounds. Then, the drawings, pages and pages of human faces, elongated, deformed, eyeless, each one marked with a spiral in the forehead, and beneath every face, a single word, kin. Rowan's final entry was just one sentence: "They do not sleep, they digest." The jawbone, carbon dated to the 17th century, gnawed, not cut, with human bite marks. And the wax cylinder? That was the most terrifying piece. When played, it emitted a low, wet, dragging sound interrupted by irregular knocks, like teeth tapping bone. But layered beneath that, at certain frequencies, was a woman's voice, reciting names, Scottish surnames, slowly, repeating, until it reached one your family might know. That's not coincidence. That's how memory travels in this lineage, not through story, but through calling. The doctrine isn't whispered anymore. It's archived, mislabeled, misfiled, and waiting to be rediscovered. It's in basements, saltwater caves, broken teeth. The hunger that guided Sawney Bean and didn't die with him. It retreated, and now it feeds through ritual, through resonance, through relics, because the spiral does not erase. It records. It catalogs every name it ever tasted. In 2004, a forensic genealogist named Dr. Irene Halley was hired to trace the bloodline of a wealthy but reclusive Scottish financier who had died without a will. The man's name was redacted from all official documents. Every trace of his existence filtered through shell trusts and offshore entities. But his estate was enormous, and Halley was promised an obscene sum to locate even a single surviving heir. Her investigation led her deep into government-sealed birth registries, psychiatric files, and orphanage records from the 1940s, many connected to closed Catholic institutions along the coast. Every lead ended in silence. Every paper trail snapped at the same generation. The children of missing mothers, mothers who had disappeared from census data just after childbirth. She found one name repeated in whispers, a midwife named Agnes McDunn, who had worked at 6 different birthing homes between 1935 and 1948. Each facility was later shut down after allegations of ritual anomalies and unsanctioned birthing practices. But Agnes had vanished. Not dead, not missing, removed. Her last known address was a lighthouse ruin perched above a sea cave in Berwickshire. Halley went there in person. What she found wasn't Agnes, but her ledger, bound in black leather filled with spiraled handwriting so tight it looked carved. Page after page listing names of infants, none registered. All marked, Bean line confirmed. Next to each, a symbol, a spiral with 1, 2, or 3 tails. Beneath it all, a phrase repeated every few pages in faded red ink. The mouth never closes, only waits. That's when Hallie ran. She withdrew from the case, declined her payment, went dark. But not before she uploaded her notes to a private server. The file name? spiralmouthgenome.doc. Before it was taken down, researchers noted something horrific. The DNA markers tied to these bean-line infants' matched a rare gene cluster that had reappeared in 3 modern cases of compulsive anthropophagy, cannibal hunger, triggered by ancestral trauma. You see, the doctrine doesn't just manipulate thought. It cultivates instinct, hidden appetites, forgotten urges passed like poison through blood, through womb, through whisper. That financier wasn't an orphan. He was a node, a carrier. And now his heirs, if found, will awaken that hunger again. In 2011, a covert division within MI5 conducted a deep audit of Scotland's dark sites, unacknowledged locations used historically for state-sanctioned experiments, interrogations, and cultural erasure. One file, marked Red Spiral Declassified, led them to the ruins of an abandoned 17th-century monastery near Dunur. Officially, it had been destroyed by fire in 1722. Unofficially, it was never recorded in ecclesiastical maps. Beneath the chapel, they found a sealed stairwell leading down, not to crypts, but to an inverted stone amphitheater carved into bedrock. The spiral design was unmistakable. What disturbed the recovery team wasn't the structure, but what lined its walls. 34 alcoves, each containing skeletal remains, some human, some not quite. Each skull had its jaw removed, but placed beneath the ribs of every corpse was a crude object. Carved spoons made of polished femur bone, engraved with a single word: belonging. At the center of the spiral pit was a slab altar scorched black and bearing a spiral groove worn smooth, as if by generations of turning motion. DNA testing later confirmed something staggering. The remains belonged to individuals with no known lineage in modern Scotland. Outliers. Genetically distinct but identical to each other. Clones? No. Copies. Recursions of a bloodline too old to trace. One geneticist noted, "It's like they weren't born. They were retrieved." That's the key the doctrine has always hidden. Not just the act of consumption, but replication. The spiral doesn't just feed, it prints. Ritual cannibalism wasn't madness, it was preservation, a way to download memory into flesh, to ensure that every time a being died, another awoke with the same hunger. Not reincarnation. Reinstatement. The institution, religious or royal, didn't burn this monastery because it feared evil. It burned it because it saw a rival archive, one that stored identity, not in books, but in bone. And what they found carved on the back of the altar confirmed it. He who eats of the Father becomes the Father. The spiral is a blood library, and we are the shelves. In 2020, a flood in the remote village of Killen unearthed something that was never meant to be found: a sealed iron hatch beneath the collapsed floor of a long-abandoned schoolhouse. Inside, rescue workers discovered a dry chamber carved into the hill's foundation, its walls lined with children's desks, each one facing a large, black mirror bolted to the stone. There were no books, no chalkboards, no signs of formal education. Only the mirror and the soundproofing. Heavy fabric stapled into the rock. A portable generator was recovered nearby, corroded but functional. When investigators restored partial power, the mirror flickered to life. Not with reflection, but with a pre-recorded feed. Children seated, staring blankly at the screen, whispering in unison. No teacher, no instructions, just recitation. And on the walls behind them, one phrase over and over again in red chalk: "Who eats, remembers." The footage lasted for 44 minutes. At the 33-minute mark, the camera zoomed in on one child. His lips still, his eyes locked. And behind him, just for a few seconds, a second face appears in the mirror's surface. Not his reflection. Something older, watching, smiling. This wasn't a classroom. It was a transmission site. A method of implanting memories through mirrored resonance, through blood-seeded imagery. Because mirrors, in Bean doctrine, aren't for reflection, they're for containment. The spiral doesn't just use symbols and sound, it uses vision, faces, recognition. Every child in that chamber bore a resemblance to documented Bean descendants. But their records? Non-existent, as if they'd been plucked from the periphery, or worse, bred for inheritance. That's the horror of it, the idea that what you see in a mirror isn't you, but what you're becoming. This school wasn't meant to educate. It was meant to embed, to transfer ancestral knowledge like malware into the bloodstream of the next host. You thought legacy was passed down through stories, but here it's passed down through the glass. That mirror is still intact. Authorities claim it was moved to storage in Edinburgh, but I know someone who saw it. He said it never stops flickering, even when unplugged, especially then. In 2022, a retired cold case analyst named Willem Cross leaked a set of encrypted files to a private dark history archive operating under the codename Silentium. The contents were disturbing, but what caught immediate attention was one folder titled Aberdeen Case, 1600 Teeth. Inside were high-resolution photos, pathology reports, and a confiscated diary recovered from a home demolition site outside Aberdeen. The site had once been an orphanage run by a long-defunct religious order expelled in 1911 for non-sanctioned sacrificial liturgies. The demolition crew had unearthed a bricked-over tunnel leading to a stone vault. Inside, 21 child-sized coffins, each one sealed with wax and embedded with teeth. Not the children's teeth, but adult molars arranged in spirals on the lids. Dental analysis confirmed the horrifying detail. All 1,600 teeth came from a single genetic line, the Bean line. But that wasn't all. Inside the coffins, beneath each child's corpse, was a thin black booklet, a devotional of sorts. But the prayers were not Christian. They spoke of rejoining the root, devouring the silence, and most chillingly, dreaming the meat back into form. The final page of each booklet bore a single instruction: when the mouth opens, follow. This wasn't a burial site, it was a pantry. The spiral doesn't just store bodies, it preserves them like seeds, waiting for the right hunger to awaken, the right name to be spoken, the right man to remember who he really is. And the teeth? Teeth carry more than decay. They hold trace mineral memories, iron, salt, soil, environmental data encrypted in enamel. These were not trophies. They were keys. Biologic signatures capable of unlocking the consciousness of a dormant lineage. What MI5 buried in Aberdeen wasn't evil. It was unfinished. A generation that never got to complete its spiral. And someone wanted to make sure they coded. Cross went missing 2 weeks after the leak. His final message was 6 words: "They're not dead, they're fermenting." Later that same year, a disgraced neuroscientist named Dr. Ansel Braith released fragments of a suppressed study he had conducted between 2009 and 2015 at a black site clinic outside Glasgow. The clinic, privately funded by what Braith called a heritage syndicate, specialized in one forbidden goal: the recovery of ancestral memory. The method was unholy, using a chemical derived from decalcified human tooth pulp, specifically teeth traced to the Bean bloodline. They administered microdoses to volunteers with genetic links to coastal Scottish ancestry. The results were catastrophic. Subjects reported waking dreams of cave fires, bone cracking and wet mouths, infants with sewn eyelids, and a figure known only as the wet grandfather, But what terrified Braith was not what they saw. It was what they began to say, in languages never taught, words that hadn't been spoken aloud in 400 years but matched fragments found in pre-Union Scottish grimoires. One participant began carving spirals into the walls of his isolation room with his teeth. Another refused food, claiming it was not kin and only accepted raw marrow. After 13 sessions, 2 subjects were dead, 5 institutionalized. The rest vanished. The funding was pulled, the clinic burned, and Braith's credentials quietly erased. But one video survived. A 58-second clip of Subject 9, eyes rolled back, reciting something over and over again. The mouth opens downward, I am below, I am waiting. Braith fled the country. He now lives off-grid in Norway, convinced the syndicate was not trying to recover history, but reactivate it, to wake something buried in the blood. Because that's what the spiral really is. Not just a symbol, but a switch. The Bean curse isn't folklore, it's firmware. The spiral is the bootloader of a memory system we were never meant to access, and once you taste from it, once it's inside you, nothing stays buried. Hunger is the operating system. The meat remembers. In early 2023, an anonymous source uploaded a decrypted Vatican communication titled Sanguinem Hereditas, File 243, Clan Bean, dated 1891, stamped with the seal of the Office of Prophetic Integrity. The letter was addressed to the Archbishop of Argyll and contained explicit instructions. Do not exhume the crypt beneath Loch Uain. Do not document the submerged chapel ruins. Do not speak the family name in sermons. The hunger must remain unprovoked. Attached were 6 photographs, grainy but unmistakable. Submerged beneath the glacial green water, visible only during a rare drought, was a stone chapel choked in vines, its entrance sealed with leaded chains and marked by a chiseled spiral that bore no moss. Divers who approached the site reported an overwhelming sense of vertigo, nausea, and, most disturbingly, the sound of infants crying from below the surface. The Vatican's records suggested that this chapel was not just a burial ground, but a containment structure built atop what they called a living reliquary. Beneath the altar, bound in salt and ash, was said to be the preserved remains of Macabre Bean, Sawney's granddaughter, and the last of the direct matriarchal line. But according to the letter, her body was not decomposed. It was hibernating. Her veins injected centuries ago with a fluid referred to as vinum carnis, the wine of flesh. Distilled from boiled infant fat and goat blood under a new moon. That wine wasn't a myth. Its formula was found again, almost identical, in a Nazi occult laboratory uncovered in 1945. Which means this knowledge, this hunger, has passed between hands, institutions, and regimes for centuries, each time seeking a new vessel. Because Macabre was no ordinary carrier, she wasn't buried to be forgotten. She was sealed to prevent return, a fail-safe. And now the seals are rusting, the lake levels are dropping, the spiral turns, and the Hirsch that once knew how to keep it down now only prays it doesn't remember the way back. But it will, because flesh cannot forget what blood was promised. 1 month after the Vatican leak, drone footage from a private expedition captured the exact moment the chapel door beneath Loch Uain cracked open. No one touched it. No one dove. The chains simply gave way. Rusted, yes, but the final snap of metal was captured on audio. Not from strain, but from something pulling inward. Within 2 weeks, reports flooded in from nearby villages, missing livestock, infants waking with bite marks on their palms, and one shepherd who slit his own throat after carving the spiral into the frozen ground with a deer antler. His suicide note read, "The mother has coughed. We are already inside her mouth." Forensic teams sent to survey the site never returned. Only their body cams were recovered, washed ashore 20 miles downstream. The footage? Nightmarish. Walls pulsing like muscle, icons melting into meat, and a sound. Wet, rhythmic, echoing through stone like the heart of something asleep and dreaming. And in one final frame, a figure crawling upside down across the ceiling, her skin translucent, teeth too many, hair floating like tendrils in still air. The spiral wasn't just a curse. It was a call and response. Every act of cannibalism, every myth of the beans, every echo of their name, all of it fed her, kept her listening, kept her pregnant with memory. And now that memory is going into labor. The last phase of the doctrine has begun, the reconstitution of flesh through remembrance, not just resurrection, but integration. The Vatican tried to cauterize it. The Crown tried to bury it. The syndicates tried to harness it. But none understood the spiral is not a tool. It is an appetite with memory. And now that it's awake, it is coming back into itself, piece by piece, through us. 3 nights after the chapel door broke, a shepherd's dog unearthed something half buried in the peat near Loch Uain. It wasn't a bone. It wasn't even a corpse. It was a tongue, fresh, human, still wet, and still twitching. When the villagers brought it to the local constable, it spasmed violently in the evidence tray, knocking itself to the floor. No one would touch it. But the local priest, an old man named Father Kerr, did. He recited the Lord's Prayer, and the tongue responded, word for word, backwards, in Gaelic. Kerr suffered a brain hemorrhage 2 hours later and died with a smile stretched so wide it tore the sides of his face. That tongue was not a leftover relic. It was a beacon, part of something reforming itself, organ by organ, voice by voice. All over Scotland, farmers reported strange finds. An eyeball in a fox den, a single breast fused to tree bark, a uterus in a nest of crows. Always warm, always twitching, always speaking if you listen too long. Because the hunger isn't just returning through bloodlines, it's reassembling through belief. Every mention, every echo, every whisper in the dark of Sawney Bean is a contribution to the body. And what is a body made of, if not shared memory, if not recognition? You think you're safe because you haven't eaten flesh, because you haven't spoken the spiral aloud. But if you're hearing this now, you're already part of it. The spiral needs attention. It feeds on curiosity, on doubt, on men who want to know more. And when it has enough, when the myth outweighs the meat, it will stand up again, wearing a body made from your questions and a voice sown from your hunger to know. This isn't a curse, it's a recruitment. And now, we've reached the second to last turn of the spiral, where truth ceases to be historical and begins to become biological. In late 2024, a private think tank operating under the name Lux Altum released a confidential briefing to its elite investors, warning of what they called a mythic pathogen. Their model didn't treat belief systems as abstract ideas, but as living, viral systems. Stories, they argued, can act as vectors, triggering biochemical changes in the brain and gut through exposure to symbolic patterns. The spiral of the Bean lineage was not just cultural memory, it was mnemonic malware designed to hijack identity, embedded in oral tradition, hidden in folklore, activated by exposure. They ran brain scans of volunteers who read aloud from original accounts of Sawney Bean's confessions. After 7 minutes, patterns in the amygdala began to mirror those seen in extreme trauma patients. But more disturbingly, gut microbiomes began to shift. Enzymes commonly used in the digestion of human protein spiked within 24 hours, without consumption, without exposure, just through story. What does this mean? It means the spiral doesn't need to be real to be alive. It means that the myth is a programmable gene activated by memory, passed through whispers, multiplied through retellings, like this one. Lux Altum concluded their briefing with a single warning. This is not folklore. This is not metaphor. This is hunger encoded in narrative form. The spiral is a sigil built to prime digestion, of identity, of empathy, of the self. And here's the question they didn't want to ask aloud. What happens when enough men awaken with this spiral inside them? What happens when they stop fearing what they could become and start remembering it? You are not listening to a story. You are digesting one, and it is digesting you back. This is your final warning, your last breath before the spiral closes behind you, because if you've made it this far, it means something in you was already turning. That hunger you feel right now, it isn't metaphor. It's recognition. The old hunger doesn't knock. It remembers your door. And the door is not out there in Scotland, not underwater, not sealed with chains. It's behind your teeth. The same pattern found in every corpse tied to the bean line, spiral etched in enamel on the molars. You carry it. We all do. That's the final truth the church couldn't erase, the crown couldn't suppress, and the syndicates couldn't control. Sawney Bean was not the origin. He was the outbreak. The manifestation of a hunger so old it predates language. What they buried was not a man. It was an instruction. The spiral is a behavioral payload, a curse disguised as a compulsion, delivered through time by blood, belief, and the need to know. Every dark story you seek, every forbidden thread you pull, feeds it, strengthens it. You came here for secrets, but what you found was your reflection. A man staring into the dark and not flinching. That's what the spiral needed. And now, it's awake in you. So if you feel it, the cold behind your ribs, the gnawing at the edge of your memory, comment this below twice to complete the circle. The flesh remembers. Again, the flesh remembers. And as the algorithm finds others like you, the spiral grows stronger. Because it doesn't need all men, just enough. Enough who are tired of masks. Enough who hunger for something real. The spiral is not just the story of cannibals in a cave. It is the system beneath all systems, a weapon that never rusts, because it wears the face of men who are finally ready to become what they were meant to be, not civilized, not saved, but sovereign. Welcome to the spiral. You are not watching anymore. You are part of it.